The UN or its failures in the Middle East. By Professor Ahmet Uysal. The victors of the First World War established the League of Nations as the first international organization that focused on collective security in 1920. It aimed at supporting peace and cooperation among countries as it tried to improve multilateral diplomacy and international law. It tried to tackle problems of health, labor, refugees, and disarmament. It was a failure because it could not prevent the breakout of the World War II and legitimized the Western colonization under the pretext of mandate system. After a huge destruction and bloodshed in World War II, the victors again wanted to continue this experience by developing it into a modern United Nations, UN, to advocate global peace, security and cooperation, to promote human rights, development, humanitarian aid. Today the UN is the biggest international organization with 193 member states. It encourages international cooperation on such issues as climate change, poverty, hunger, health, and education, and human rights. It has branches such as the International Court of Justice, Economic and Social Council and specialized agencies such as for health, WTO, children, UNICEF, food, and refugees. The United Nations also has activities of peacekeeping, humanitarian aid, human rights, development efforts, and conflict resolution. The UN achieved some successes in preventing global wars, but it could not prevent the bilateral wars or invasions such as the Korean War to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, Iran-Iraq War, and other crises in the Middle East and the Ukraine War. The organization was criticized for its inefficiency of its heavy bureaucracy. The 78th General Assembly gathered last week with wide participation, but the outcome is weak. Both the Qatari Emir Tamim Al Thani and the Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan called for the importance of accomplishing the original goals of the UN and for a peaceful and just Middle Eastern peace in Gaza. Both leaders emphasized the need for a legitimate international system where the rule of law prevails, and both called for reforms in the United Nations institutions to carry out their responsibilities in order to achieve peace and sustainable justice. Erdogan criticized the unfair dominance of 5 countries, the USA, Russia, China, France, and the UK, with veto powers on the UN Security Council. Ironically, the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu was allowed to address the General Assembly to justify its massacres in Gaza in a defiant manner to the UN itself. For a long time Israel ignores the UN resolutions, e.g. 1322, 1435, 2334, about respecting international law on protection of civilians and stopping the building of settlements. The U.S. government already vetoed many draft resolutions in advance in the UN Security Council. Even if they are passed by the General Assembly, Israel does not implement these resolutions. In a way, Israel says I don't recognize the UN, but the UN does not do the same thing. Instead, the UN allowed Israel to defy and to criticize the UN and the world community. What a democratic institution the UN has become. The UN that is supposed to find solutions to other Middle East crises such as Syria and Yemen but did not do so. This time Russia and China vetoed the resolutions about the Syrian conflict and humanitarian situation. The UN finally agreed on the Geneva process for a political solution in Syria, but it is not moving forward and the implementation is weak. The UN played a somewhat constructive role in Libya in freezing the conflict, but a lasting peace and political stability are still too far. Today the Gaza crisis is a year old, and the UN is failing to stop Israeli aggression legally, but it is also failing to provide Palestinians with humanitarian aids. The backers of Israel are supervisors of Israel as well. Unlike the Syria crisis, the superpowers are not canceling each other on Gaza, but the outcome is almost zero. The solution is not the dissolution of the United Nations but to reform it in a fair way, to democratize it to include more countries from Africa, Asia and Islamic countries, and to cancel the veto system that favor a few strong countries unfairly.